this presentation today. So today we've invited an interdisciplinary panel of experts for a discussion on how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted our agricultural sector, to explore the relationship between health and equity when it comes to food access, and to provide insight into how the pandemic has affected food security in Canada. We have an amazing panel today, so without further ado, I'm going to start introducing our speakers. We have Dr. Valerie Tarasik, who is a professor in the Nutritional Sciences Department at the University of Toronto. Valerie's work is primarily focused in food insecurity, and her work in this area has included several studies to elucidate the scope, nature, and health implications of this problem in Canada, and examine the effectiveness of community-based responses. Since 2011, she has led PROOF, an interdisciplinary research program launched with funding from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and designed to identify effective policy approaches to reduce household food insecurity in Canada. So welcome, Valerie. We have Jade Guthrie with us, who is an educator and a food justice advocate, passionate about her work engaging communities through food. In her work at Food Share Toronto, Jade develops and facilitates hands-on workshops with folks cooking and eating together while opening up conversations about the food system. Outside of her 9-to-5, Jade sits on the Toronto Youth Food Policy Council and is a member of Justice for Migrant Workers, a volunteer-run political collective which strives to promote the rights of migrant farm workers. We have Chris Ramzaroop, who is an organizer with Justice for Migrant Workers. He is an instructor at the Caribbean Studies program at the University of Toronto and a clinic instructor at the University of Windsor Faculty of Law. Ramzaroop is currently working to complete his PhD at the University of Toronto. And for those of you who don't know, Justice for Migrant Workers is a grassroots activist collective that has been organizing with migrant workers for nearly 20 years. Their work is based in building long-term trust and relationships with migrant workers and includes engaging in direct actions, working with members to resist at work, launching precedent-setting legal cases, and organizing numerous collective actions. And we have Alex Chesney, who is a registered dietitian and farmer, living and working on her family's fruit and vegetable farm. Alex is passionate about educating the community on the local food system by entwining how food is grown and harvested and how it can be prepared and how it can nourish us. She oversees the farm's on-farm market and Pick Your Own Patch, spaces where visitors can experience local agriculture firsthand. She is also hard at work planning the addition of an on-farm kitchen and interactive workshops and experiences that will bring farm to table to life. So we've got people here with lots of knowledge and lots of wisdom and insight. So I kind of want to get started with Chris and Alex, if you can tell us a little bit more about your work in the agricultural sector and how in the last year has the pandemic affected Canada's agricultural sector, and were there major threats or gaps exposed? Maybe starting with you, Chris.
So thanks for having me. And I guess I want to take just 1 minute to recognize a comrade, Dr. Aziz Chowdhury, who just passed, we found out early this morning. Aziz was a leading scholar internationally in the area of migration and food issues. So I wanted to start off just to honor his memory and his contributions to our movement. So since the start of the pandemic, I just want to cite some figures from the Ministry of Health, which I got. They change every day. So there has been over 2,891 farm workers, both Canadian and migrant workers, who have tested positive for COVID. There's been 3,217 food processing workers who've tested positive, both Canadian and workers with precarious status. Currently, we have 12 farms as of today that have their COVID outbreaks and 13 food processing facilities. Of course, this is not a full picture, and why I use farm and food processing interconnectedly is as a result because a lot of farm workers who are getting COVID are being misclassified as food processing workers. So there continues to be a crisis in the agricultural labor force, but particularly with the migrant workers and what they're seeing. And I think what we saw in the beginning is there's been two main narratives. There's been a mainstream narrative that's been implemented by the Canadian state, the agricultural industry, and the media of Canadian society that will go into a crisis if we do not have migrant farm workers come to Canada as quote unquote essential workers. We saw this coming from the words from the Prime Minister of Canada. We saw this from employer lobby organizations, and we saw this mimicked language by media. At the same time, simultaneously, we've seen a jostling for understanding what the word essential means. And when we closed the borders, two things happened with migrant farm workers. And I'll get to the components about essential workers a little bit later. But two things we saw. Workers who were in Canada prior to the borders being closed. We saw many workers being curfewed on farms, not being able to leave. And this is not just a quarantine period, but this is the entire facility, it's the entire time that you're here in Canada. We saw threats of termination for workers if they did try to go buy, say, PPE on their own or try to go get groceries. We also saw both with workers who were coming to Canada and workers who are already here, concerns around culturally appropriated food with respect to quarantine. And when workers are being quarantined on farms, and the two examples were that food were just workers were giving food that wasn't simply healthy, and there is a religious component. So, say for instance, you're Muslim or Hindu, and Muslim workers would be given pork, Hindu workers would be given beef, and Rastafarians would be given pork and beef or meat, which they don't eat. So there's definitely these other forms of discrimination that was happening around this, and workers basically used Messenger. And Facebook and WhatsApp to expose some of these conditions that were going on. Now, the workers who were not able to come to Canada, we also saw the idea that people have been paying into our social safety net for 5 decades. We're not able to collect any benefits, whether it's CERB or unemployment insurance during their time of need, because they're seen as foreign nationals or foreigners in another country. So in effect, when our border closed, it had a dual impact of basically leaving these workers on their own devices, where they were not able to survive, or not able to put food on their table because of the closure of our border. And you're like, well, why does that concern me? Why should I care about a bunch of workers in the global south who can't get EI? They're from another country. So I want us to remember this before I close, and then I want to engage in a conversation. You'll all probably get bored hearing me talk, anyways. But I want us to remember one of the key things here about the migrant worker population. They have a strong labor attachment. I will call it a dependency to working in Canada. Many of these workers, this is their sole source of income. And there's many reasons for that. And part of that is twofold in my mind. One is because of the impoverishment that exists in the Caribbean and Mexico and the global south. But it's not just simply that the countries of the Caribbean and the global south can't get their act together. This is a longer history of slavery, colonialism, indentureship, and the global economic structuring that continues to perpetuate an economic disfiguration of the global south to the north. So this is a sole job for many of the peeps, whether they're working in Canada right now or whether they haven't been able to come. The second feature that people do not talk about the temporary foreign worker programs. And my family came to the Caribbean as indentured laborers in the 1800s, early 1900s. And what we're seeing here is kind of a replication of a system that creates a perpetual system of indentured labor, where workers are tied to one employer. Workers do not have labor and social mobilities. And the existing protection that should exist within our labor systems don't exist for the workers in those industries. So we've created a context which have only added fuel to the fire during COVID. And I'm happy to discuss this more. I'm always concerned and I'm cautious about time. And I'll just turn it over to other peeps.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. I think you've really painted the picture of what's happening in the agricultural sector and with these programs and for the last year, especially with COVID numbers and the abhorrent conditions that workers continue to live in and how things are getting worse. And I definitely want to dive into that a little bit more as well. Alex, what are your thoughts on how the pandemic has affected the agricultural sector?
Hi, so my perspective is much more narrow, and I can speak to our experience on my family's farm. So when the pandemic first struck in early 2020, we were at a time where we were about to start planting, about to start the season. Things hadn't really started yet. So we, as everyone, had to make a lot of decisions based on very little and rapidly developing information. And we definitely had some conversations about whether or not we should plant that year. We weren't sure what was going to happen. We did have some perennial crops like asparagus and blueberries that are going to grow no matter what. So, you know, there were some things that were going to proceed as usual, but we knew right away we do on our farm have workers through the seasonal agricultural worker program, and we knew that they would be at best delayed in arriving, and we weren't sure what was going to happen. Eventually, they were able to arrive, thankfully, and because school was canceled, we had some local students, and things kind of came together. But that was one impact in terms of the agricultural sector. Branching off from that, other effects that we saw, I think the main one was in terms of how our customers and the community were accessing and the food and our avenues of sales. In the past, we've attended many farmers markets, and those were delayed in opening. Some didn't open at all, particularly those in Toronto. They fell under special event permits, so that took some time. Those were all canceled when the pandemic started. So it took some time to get kind of the exception made for the farmers markets. So in response to that, we launched a home delivery service. Other farms responded in different ways. And we also, in terms of accessing the produce, saw a huge growth in interest in our on-farm market sales and our especially pick your own patches. I think because they were outdoors, people felt like they could be spread out. That interest has sort of calmed down this year, I think, as we've all sort of settled into this routine, I suppose. And then a couple other ways we saw impacts in terms of the agricultural sector are with some supply chain issues. That's kind of been more relevant this year, actually, in 2021, with certain, like our row covers that we use for covering strawberries and things like that, we have been hard to access this year. Specialized machinery parts have been very delayed or not accessible, and packaging, things like that. And then the last thing I would say the impact we saw was sort of some contradictions in regulations and government body recommendations. Just one example is our farms inspected annually for food safety. And one of the tenets of the food safety program is that we leave all of our barn doors closed to prevent contamination from birds, pests, and dust. But health and safety for workers recommends that we leave them open to increase airflow. So just decisions like that kind of were being told two different things. So those are sort of the four main areas that I found we were affected.
That's really interesting. I think it's not a narrow perspective at all. You've got like the boots on the ground. You have the issues with harvesting and supply and getting the workers and now just food distribution and being innovative in that sense of changes that you've had to make for your farm. And so that was really interesting. Jade and Valerie, do you have anything you want to add to how the pandemic's affected Canada's agricultural sector? Or maybe Jade, if I can ask you, with your work over the last year, has there been greater discussion on the importance of the temporary foreign agricultural workers and the critical role that they play in Canada's agricultural sector? Maybe if you could tell us a bit more about Canada's temporary foreign agricultural worker program and what implications COVID-19 has had.
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, I think you're right. There has been kind of a more mainstream, widespread conversation about the program as a result of COVID-19 and the ways that the pandemic has kind of exposed certain problems. But I do think it's really important to recognize that this is a conversation that activists and workers have been having for decades. And so it's not a new conversation, and the problems themselves are not new problems. It's just that they've been exposed and exacerbated in new ways that we're kind of seeing come to the surface in more mainstream media outlets. So maybe I can start by just chatting briefly about what the seasonal agricultural worker program is. I know Chris started kind of go into it, and then I can look a little bit more at how COVID has impacted it. But basically, our agricultural industry relies on the seasonal agricultural worker program, or SAWP, if you like to call it. The government brings in temporary farm workers from other countries to work in Canada during the farming season. These are the folks that are putting fresh produce on Canadians' tables across the country every day. And I think it's really important, like Chris mentioned, to note that workers often come from, the so-called global south or so-called developing countries, often, Indo-Caribbean countries. And this means that workers are disproportionately Black and Brown and Indigenous. And I think it's really important when we have these conversations to recognize that the SAWP is rooted in these systems of racism and of colonialism, right? Like Chris said, it's just an extension of these things that have existed and that our country was built on. And it's evidenced in the structures of the program, right? Even the kind of way that it's set up, it classifies these Black and Brown workers as, good enough to exploit for labor, so that we can put food on the table, but they're also not deserving of permanent status within the system, right? And I think it's also clear within the ways that kind of plantation dynamics are reproduced on the actual farms, and we see this across the country. It's largely white settler employers who bring in BIPOC workers, exploit their labor for a very small amount of money, often under minimum wage, and also house folks in segregated conditions, right? So we see this kind of reproduction of these same racial hierarchies over and over again here, and colonial hierarchies as well. I think another thing that's really important to know about the program is that it's very employer centric. So it favors the financial and economic interests of these big corporate farms and agricultural sector over the rights of the workers themselves, right? I think often the narrative that we hear about the SAWP kind of globally and within Canada is that it's this incredible inclusive immigration program where we're bringing in, multiculturalism and celebrating tolerance and acceptance. But the fact is that it's a scheme that brings in billions of dollars into Canada's agricultural industry, right? We're profiting off of the backs of Black and Brown folks. And I think that's really crucial to kind of remember. And we also have seen that in the ways that COVID-19 has played out in the government response to it within the industry. Like Chris said, workers have no labor mobility in this program. It's indentured labor. They're tied to one employer. Employers have the power to repatriate workers. And that often happens when workers speak up about, like unsafe working conditions, or they speak up about experiencing racism, or they're hurt on the job, right? So there's these kind of like really oppressive power structures that are built into the program, where employers are afforded all of the power. And although, there might be some employers who provide decent working conditions or decent living conditions, the fact of the matter is that the structures that are in place don't compel them to do that, right? There's no kind of way that this is being enforced. And we've seen that play out over the course of the pandemic with, like Chris said, workers sending us videos of these cramped bunkhouses, or the food that they're being forced to eat, the lack of PPE and unsafe working conditions that they're being forced to endure, right? So I think like when we talk about COVID-19 within this context, it's really kind of exacerbated these dynamics, and the government response has really kind of offloaded more responsibility onto employers, which has in turn kind of yielded more power for them, right? So we've seen the government really funneling money into employers' pockets, expecting them to take the steps they need to protect workers, and that's just not happening. So we saw tons of money going into the agricultural industry to safely, house and care for workers during quarantine periods. But what we're seeing is, like Chris said, like a lack of nutritious or culturally appropriate food. We're seeing workers being forced to live in these cramped bunkhouses with these like cardboard dividers. There's no room for physical distancing, all of this stuff. And that's what's happening. We don't know where the money is going that the government is putting into employers' pockets to take steps to actually protect workers, right? We've also seen workers being forced to work after testing positive for COVID-19. And they have, little to no access to healthcare. And this has led to these massive outbreaks of COVID-19 on farms across the country. We've seen it really clearly here in Ontario, especially. And this has led to many workers dying as a result of it, right? There's at least 6 workers who have died across Canada as a result of the virus. And that number is likely a lot higher than we actually know. And, you know, outside of that, we've also seen this kind of narrative around migrant workers during the pandemic that that they're being kind of criminalized and increased surveillance of workers as a result of the pandemic. You know, this kind of narrative that there's these workers who are breaking quarantine and spreading the virus in these small rural towns, right? And that's not the case. It's we should be questioning what kind of working and living conditions they're being forced to endure rather than criminalizing these Black and brown folks even more than they already are, right? In these overly white spaces. And then the last thing also that I just wanted to highlight is that these same kind of big corporate farms that are bringing in all of these workers are now donating all this excess food waste they have, you know, which is often framed as this idea of like food rescue, which seems like this really amazing, benevolent thing. It gets them these huge tax credits and gets all these subsidies, which obviously is great for them. While in the background, you know, their workers are the same people who are being hit the hardest by the pandemic, being hit the hardest by food insecurity and poverty as a result of their super oppressive and abusive labor practices, right? So there's this kind of like double narrative where they're really kind of hiding what's happening behind the scenes. I don't know, Chris, if you have anything to add there.
Yeah,
No, that
Jess,
was
if you could
beautiful.
pipe in.
Beautiful.
I kind of wanted to ask you, Jade, too, if, like you said, these discussions have been happening for years, decades, and they've come to light more recently. And I think like part of it has to do with social media, with organizations like Justice for Migrant Workers who are getting the information out there. For our viewers today, where would you say is the best place to get information about what's actually happening? Because the information that the government might portray can seem like a totally different story, or the information that these large farms are telling our public can be quite different. So where should people go for accurate depiction of what's happening?
Well, I mean, I'll just like shamelessly plug Justice for Migrant Workers social media here, probably, because we do try to update folks on what we know is going on. So we have Instagram and it's at Harvesting Freedom. And we have a blog and we have like Facebook pages you can follow. We're doing a really cool webinar series right now about migrant workers' rights during COVID. So that's what I'm going to say. But there's also tons of other resources as well.
That's fantastic. That's a great place for our viewers to start with. Alex, as a registered dietitian and a farmer, what are your thoughts on the last year and what's been happening with the SAWP program and the implications that COVID-19 has had?
Thanks, Jade and Chris. So again, I can speak to our experience on our farm. The role of the seasonal agriculture worker program on our farm. We have about 40 workers that come to work on our farms through that program. We also employ local staff, and so, you know, I think the nature of agriculture, at least in the fruit and vegetable sector, is that it is seasonal. So it's difficult to find a lot of local staff sometimes that are available for just, you know, 6 to 8 months of the year. We have students and some local staff that help with seeding and things like that. And then our seasonal agriculture workers also help with planting and harvesting and packing. So the workers, yeah, they kind of share those tasks. The impact of COVID, the main impact I would say that we experienced was sort of what Jade was saying about figuring out how to do things. Especially things like the 2-week quarantine period. When our workers did arrive in later in March 2020, April 2020, there wasn't a lot of direction on how we were supposed to go about doing certain things. So we sort of had to figure things out on our own, like how to coordinate food supply and how to coordinate symptom monitoring, things like that. Something that we've experienced and not just with COVID, but in general, is a lack of translated materials sometimes. I don't speak a lot of Spanish. My husband and my father both do, so we were able to create some materials on our own. But in terms of, you know, in 2021, they introduced a day 10, now day 8 mandatory test for COVID. And with our first group of workers, there were no Spanish-speaking nurses on staff through this program, which was a big challenge for us. And again, there were some contradictions and unclear direction on who to go to with questions. Our local public health unit didn't know about this program at first. So it was it was just difficult to find information, and the testing system had a lot of errors, and there was just a lot of miscommunication. So it was hard to know where to find support and information. So that's probably the main impact that we experienced.
Thank you, Alex. That was really interesting to hear. And I love that you've been able to again being able to innovate and to change things on the spot to allow for all these changes that happened in the last year. Chris, I want to ask you, based on the changes caused by COVID-19, what are the short-term and long-term impacts on our food supply? And where do we need to go next to support the health of our population?
Before I get into that, I want to talk about the crisis around the food, and I have to give a shout out to Jade. Of course I'm biased. She's a member of Justicia, blah, blah, blah. But, Jade, through her other work in Food Share, was able to, connect us to engage in a project of getting healthy food to workers, organic vegetables, fruits and vegetables. Other members of the group were able to do the deliveries in a very, protective, safe way. This type of project is one of the things I think was one of the foundational, and it wasn't based on this idea of charity, but it was just based on this idea of trying to engage in solidarity and to expose this hypocrisy of the people who are picking our fruits and vegetables who are also simultaneously going hungry, while many segments of the agricultural industry are posting huge profits. So this was a critically important role that many members in Justicia undertook. Elizabeth Hod, Windsor, Gabriel. There's been a group of people out there almost every week, Abdullah, Elizabeth Mondeo, who've been getting this work done. Now, the short term and the long term, and what we've seen is there's been a lot of attention about the crisis on agriculture. And sadly, like every other crisis that's existed around labor, we've seen a reorganizing by the industry and by politicians in the interests of the employers to keep the status quo of the employer-driven program. And one of the things I wanted to point out, there's two aspects of there. We're seeing the acceleration of numbers, increasing numbers of temporary foreign workers coming to Canada to meet the needs of employers. We're also seeing the expansion of the commodity list. So in December of 2020, we saw the expansion of which crops seasoned agricultural workers could come to be employed on. And this is a slap in the face to many of us because we think it's the other direction. Now, I want to caveat, we do not call for the abolition of the program. I want to be straight up about that. When I talk about the other direction, what I mean is about talking about changes to our immigration system, where workers should be coming with a permanent status on arrival, and changes to our labor legislation, so workers have full protections under Employment Standards Act, our Occupational Health and Safety Act, and like other workers in other industries, the right to collectively bargain, and ensuring that there is access to healthcare. Now, just two Ministry of Labor data sets that came out in the last couple of months. Yesterday, reported in the St. Catharines Standard, there was 332 inspections, occupational health and safety inspections undertaken by the Ministry of Labor. I believe they gave 86 orders and 9 tickets. So out of that small subset of farms that hires migrant workers, I'm going to assume, a lot of employers were not in compliance. And this doesn't include the fact that there is an absence of regulations, an absence of laws in the agriculture industries to protect workers. With respect to with employment standards, and just to follow up, migrant workers, both temporary foreign workers and SOP workers and undocumented workers, I'm sorry, we're seen as vectors of the disease. They were blamed for the outbreak on farms, which is outrageous and hypocritical. In some communities, local politicians were calling for more border enforcement and OPP, provincial police enforcement of workers' movements, which is should be scary for all of us. And this was pre Ford announcements about trying to ticket anybody going to emergency appointments a couple of months ago. So those, I think at the federal level, it's not about putting more resources into policing and surveillance. It's about building communities, providing support, the infrastructure to help workers out, providing supports in our communities to access to healthcare and protections around employment standards, occupational health and safety protections. And the shocking number, and why I wanted to talk about undocumented workers, because they were seen in the Windsor-Essex area as this crisis. And the Ministry of Labor did a snap proactive inspections. They interviewed, they went in and checked in 45 contractors. A few months ago, 23 of those inspections were finished. 21 out of those 23 agencies were found not to be compliant. Only 2 were. $1.5 million of the small set of money was owed to workers, $1.5 million, and only, I believe, $400,000 was recovered. And I have to remind you once again, agricultural workers don't have the full protections. They don't have the right to overtime, the right to holiday pay, the right to vacation pay, the right to minimum hours of work. Now imagine in an industry where workers had equal protections, I say construction or mining workers, there's a sure hell of a lot of wage theft that's going on. And the last part, the 2 last parts, of course, is the housing situation. Why housing continues to be a crisis is there's a multi-jurisdictional approach here, a jurisdictional football that happens. The federal government's like, oh my, I'm so sorry about the bad conditions, but we can't do anything. The provincial government, the same thing. The Ministry of Labor could look at the workplace, but we can't look at housing. And so, we're shit out of luck. Nobody could do anything about it. So housing continues to be a problem because it's not covered under occupational health and safety laws or the Landlord-Resident Tenancies Act. Workers do not have the agency within their workplace and their housing jurisdiction that's needed. The most important thing for us as a society is to rethink our food system. Do we want a food system where the 1% continues to profit? This last quarter, exports increased by 14.6% in prices, and I think it's up to $18.6 billion, which is about a $2 billion increase from the year before. Do we want a farming industry and a food system that feeds communities or engages in a system based on profit? And just my last example, and why, being from Toronto, of course, loving, hip hop and everything else, being an urban idiot, as some would call us, the thing that makes me the most outraged and angry is when I see a greenhouse, for instance, in Windsor, Essex, where most of its crops is for export production on one side. And then they could pick up on one day and say, look, I don't want to grow tomatoes or green peppers. I'm going to switch over and do cannabis, hoping to make a quicker buck. And when I can't make that quicker buck, I may turn back to tomatoes and vegetables. When people are growing hungry in our society and we're contributing because of our export policies to hunger in the global south, moving forward, the crisis needs to teach us we need to protect our communities. And I'm not talking protect Canadians, I'm talking about protecting the globe and not basing a food system and an agricultural system that's premised on profit. Now that's it. I'll shut up.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you, Chris. I think you really captured that really well. I want to put you on the spot and talk about the immigration policies that were announced by the Canadian government recently and how that doesn't really measure up to what migrant workers need. Can you speak a little on that?
Yeah, okay, so I want to be clear. I ain't a lawyer, right? I'm just a rabble-rouser. But I hate these. Okay, these changes do nothing. Right? I know a lot of people are going around congratulating themselves and saying how beautiful it is. All right. So I want us to remember this, that the temporary foreign worker programs, predominantly the low-skilled programs, whether it's in construction or agriculture or the seasoned agriculture worker program, does not have a way for workers to have permanent residency. It's a simple managed migration scheme where the workers have to return when their contracts are done. This recent announcement that was undertaken where the Liberals introduced a one-time only plan to have 90,000 people come to Canada. I believe 30,000 were for international students, which are filled. 20,000 were for health professionals, and 30,000 were for other essential workers in 94 other industries. Why we say Canada has a racist immigration system, it's not through overt practices, but covert natures or covert ways of racially coded language. So most of the farm worker peeps that we know, whether they're Guatemalan or Mexican or Caribbean workers, will not be able to pass the language tests that are pretty high threshold, despite their years of contribution to our society and our contribution to our economy. So what we're saying is to respect and to acknowledge that workers who are coming here should be like the Dutch, like the Polish before them, have the ability of labor and social mobility. When we started bringing Black workers and then brown workers later on, this is when we saw the shift on our immigration laws, where workers became tied at the federal level. And we saw this growing decrease of protections at the provincial level. So most of these workers, this is a divide and roll on our side. Most agricultural workers will not be able to qualify. Most workers will not be able to pass a language test, which we believe are racially exclusive. Third, many of the workers, undocumented workers, so people who've lost their work permits, people who are escaping the deplorable conditions, all these workers are excluded from this program. Workers who were repatriated for standing up for their rights. Sisters and brothers and comrades who worked decades before this announcement will have no ability to come here. So this program leaves a whole swath of people under this guise of inclusivity and protecting essential workers. It doesn't do this for the people that we believe need this to help to continue to build our society. We have to ask ourselves, do we really value the skills that Caribbean, Mexican, Guatemalan, Thai, Filipino, Honduran, Indonesian workers do every day to put food on our tables? And my argument has been consistently no. And the government could take the immediate steps to end their racism, to end the divisiveness, and to end the employer dominance of this program, but it chooses not to do so.
Thank you for summarizing. Even though you say you're not a lawyer, you very concisely and clearly described that for our viewers, which is the most important part. People need to understand what's going on. Valerie, I kind of want to turn things over to you and learn a little bit more about how has COVID-19 impacted household food insecurity in Canada. So we talked a little bit about food insecurity for migrant workers, and I want to go a little bit wider for all Canadians. What are the implications? What are the changes that you've seen?
So, I mean, one of the impacts of COVID on food insecurity in Canada is that it upended the monitoring system for food insecurity. Back in last March, when things started to shut down, they didn't just shut down in, the lives of people in Toronto. The Statistics Canada division that was responsible for the Canadian Community Health Survey suspended data collection. So basically the lights were turned out on the problem. And that was one of many examples. There were many ways in which the lights got turned out, but the starting point for us from a food insecurity perspective is that we stopped counting. So in May of last year, Statistics Canada tried to repair some of that damage by running a short online survey of a population-based sample only from the 10 provinces, so not counting the territories at all. And it was online. And I mean, as soon as you run an online survey, you have to worry about who participates and who doesn't participate. And it became very quickly apparent that that sample from that online survey was biased towards more stable, affluent, domiciled, educated people. Even with without the 3 territories, one of which we knew historically had very, very high rates of food insecurity. So even with all that, what we came away with was a startling number that the rate of food insecurity based on that survey appears to have risen. At least at that time, it looked like it had risen, so that 1 in 7 households were reporting some level of difficulty in being able to afford the food they needed. And when within that small sample, when we look more closely at who they were, households that had a child under the age of 18 in them were way more likely to report those problems. So 1 in 5 as opposed to 1 in 7. Who was there? Well, prior to the pandemic, we knew that most of the food insecure households in this country were in the workforce. And so the disruptions of the pandemic to people's work could only kind of elevate that vulnerability. So when we look at who it is in that 1 in 7, based on a survey that I do not think we could ever claim was representative, we can see it's people whose work was disrupted, people who were thrown out of work because of COVID, people who were unable to transition from working away from home to home. They were vulnerable. People who had always been working from home were also more vulnerable than those who, like me, were easily able to transition from my workplace to my house. Also, of course, were people who did not have work at all. And so there we sit with the often cited statistic of 1 in 7. We don't know what's happened since last May. Eventually we'll find out. I mean, there's more stuff happening and there'll be more data collection, and eventually some of this stuff will come to roost. But it's interesting the number of times I hear people speaking publicly about how this problem is taken off and it's a crisis or whatever. I mean, there's nothing about COVID that would have made the problems of food insecurity that Canada had before COVID. There's nothing about the pandemic that would have made them better. And for some people, things will have gotten worse. How much worse and which people, it'll be a while before there's a postmortem there. But as you look at the conversation that's happening, that's happened today, but the broader conversation that's happening in urban areas about where COVID is in racialized communities, but also in workplaces with racialized workers largely, but people who can't afford to stay home, right? People who don't have paid sick days, and repeatedly we're told about these huge outbreaks in these, meat packing plants and warehouses and whatever. Repeatedly we're told that those are workers who can't afford to not go to work, even if they're in trouble. Like, I'm quite sure that, and why can't they afford to do that? Because they wouldn't be able to pay their rent. I'm quite sure that if we came along and administered food insecurity measurements to those people, they would be those people, right? They're the same people. So there are people who've been tossed out of work, who've been vulnerable. There are people who were on social assistance before and continue to be vulnerable because that is a program that basically guarantees them a food insecurity. And then we've got this raft of people in the workforce or in some way who were vulnerable before and can only still be vulnerable.
Thank you for discussing the data and maybe the gaps in the data and what our future directions are. I'm interested to know, and I know our viewers are as well, what policies or programs are needed to help combat food insecurity in Canada? So not just during this time of COVID, but overall, what programs do we need in Canada?
Well, I mean, the food insecurity that I'm talking about is people not being able to afford to buy the food that they need for themselves and their families. And at the end of the day, that's about how much money they've got in their purse. So what are the policies that we need in place? Policies that enable people to have decent incomes, stable, secure, adequate incomes. It's as simple as that. So that relates to employment policies and practices, so that there are wages that are adequate, but also that there's more controls around things like hours worked. Also things like welfare. As I said earlier, it's basically a guarantee that people will be food insecure. And so, there are a range of programs and policies in Canada that impact people's income either directly or indirectly. And there's no reconciling of that spectrum of activity against basic needs and the costs of basic needs. And so that's why pre-pandemic, we had 4.4 million people living in food insecure situations. And that number, I'm quite sure, is not going to have gotten any smaller. What's interesting about food insecurity through the pandemic, though, in addition to this turning off of the lights, what we've had both at the provincial and at the federal level is this sudden outpouring of public money for food charity. So we saw last April, Trudeau announce first 100 million and then another 100 million and then 50 million. Now in the most recent federal budget, we've got another 140 million. And that's just federal. I mean, we know that at least at the beginning of the pandemic in Ontario, Doug Ford committed 8 million to buying food for food banks. I mean, across the country, we've seen governments rush forward with money for food charity in a way that never happened before the pandemic. It's very concerning that this, at a time where I feel like we've got a lot of information about what drives this problem and what mitigates it. We've never known more about food insecurity than we do now. And yet, what have we got? This race to pour money into voluntary community-based food charities that do not function as entitlement programs, that have no accountability for their impact. And yet, if you look at the most recent federal budget, we've got what's called the Emergency Food Security Fund, And it's being described as preventing people from going hungry. I mean, if there's one thing we know with certainty, it is that food charity does not prevent people from going hungry, right? I mean, there's no debate about that. Even the people who run food charities will admit it. And yet, it's a frightening turning point for us, because we've got a lapse in terms of standard monitoring, but we've got this whole new policy arm developing that is really, really regressive in terms of how it's framing the problem and how it's framing the solution.
Absolutely. I love that you simplified what is food insecurity. It's a lack of income, enough income to adequately access food, and have food charities not the solution, and some other better solutions. Jay, do you want to add to what policies and programs do you think are needed to help combat food insecurity in Canada?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think, recognizing that we can't talk about food insecurity without talking about structural poverty is really, really important. And that means we do need these kind of income-based solutions. We need to prioritize those, just making sure, like Valerie said, putting money in people's pockets so they can buy the food that they want to eat is like the number one thing for sure. Along with these kind of like ensuring that there's decent work and labor policies that protect workers, especially workers along the food chain who happen to be the most food insecure folks, as we've seen throughout the pandemic. I think also, just generally moving away from this really like siloed approach to looking at food insecurity. Like we need to, like I said, recognize how it's connected to structural poverty, but also to things like systemic racism and to settler colonialism, and coming up with sustainable solutions that actually change those systems as well. Like we can't just be looking at food insecurity as an issue of access, but as like an issue of broken, or not even a food system that was designed to make profit rather than feed people, right? Like here in Canada, we have the right to food. So I think that means we need to ensure that we're building solutions that implement measures that will support this right? So like even thinking about things like how investment in affordable housing or investment in childcare would help folks with alleviating food insecurity, right? And then looking at our immigration system, like Chris mentioned earlier, how do we create like how do we rebuild our food system in a way that is robust and actually inclusive so workers aren't being left behind, right? How do we move away from giving tax credits to these abusive employers and instead ensuring that workers are getting the benefits that they pay into, like CDP or EI, or something like universal basic income, right? So how do we begin to imagine these solutions that are more all-encompassing and look at the food system from every level rather than just at the tail end of it, which is what happens. That's how we get things like food banking, right? That's why the government is funneling all of this money into food banking and food rescue, because it's this like really one-dimensional understanding of food insecurity as being an access issue when it's like actually an entire system that needs to be transformed.
If there was one takeaway that you think our viewers, our listeners today could enact, or an action item, Jade, what do you think people should be doing to support both food insecurity, migrant workers, food access?
That's a tough one. I mean, I think, learning more about our food system is a good step. I think, you talk to a lot of folks and they've never even heard of the seasonal agriculture worker program, right? People don't even know that that's something that happens here in Ontario. Or people might not know that Black folks are like 3.5 times more likely to be food insecure than white folks here in Canada. And so I think like the education and advocacy piece is like a big part. I don't think that, I think it's important to recognize that it's like systemic changes we need and not just like the actions of individuals. But yeah, I think education is important.
Fantastic. And you gave the details of where to go to follow Justice for Migrant Workers, as well as you can follow Food Chat Toronto and get more information there, and be part of the advocacy. Alex, what are your thoughts on maybe one action item based on today's discussion?
Yeah, I totally agree with Jade that education is important. And I think that for anyone on the line who works in the area of nutrition and dietetics, continuing to consider agriculture and those who work in it as the basis of our food system, and therefore an important part of the education that we pass on to our clients and people we work with.
Absolutely. As part of the field, I feel like, nutrition and dietetics can sometimes be disconnected from the people that actually grow and harvest our food. So that's a great takeaway. Valerie, what are your thoughts on an action item our listeners and viewers can implement?
Well, I'm not nearly as nice as the other panelists here. I think that it's really, if you're concerned about these issues, I think it's really important that you make your voice heard, because we're seeing change all the time, right? And at some level, nothing changes, and yet at another level, things are changing constantly. And if I think for me about things like this funding for food charity that we're seeing coming out of public monies. I mean, if you care about these issues, I think you have to make your opinion known to the people that are your elected officials. I think people need to understand that there are large swaths of Canadians that actually aren't in favor of all of this. And I think we have to make our voices heard. So that would be my recommendation, that yes, it's important for people to build awareness, but it's also important to express your views.
Absolutely. So I think like education and learning is one piece of it, and then moving into that action, and not performative action, not just posting on social media and things like that, actually getting on, supporting your community, getting out to support organizations, and getting political, like you said, getting in touch with your MPP or whoever your member of parliament might be. Chris, what are your thoughts on an action item that viewers can implement?
So I'm definitely not nice. I think I've called enough politicians telling them they've got their blood on their hands. Same with a lot of employers. So I don't think I'm a nice person. But I think it's definitely, it's about consciousness raising. So, and I want us to think about consciousness raising is not just simply about understanding or coming to know how things are, but transformation of our society. Holding politicians, I think, is one thing to account, and holding them responsible for the crimes they're committing against our society is definitely one part of this. But it's also ensuring that, this longer historical understanding of how things are happening. The fact that we've got Black and Brown people under conditions of exploitation in their fields today, very akin to 150 or 200 years ago. It's having this longer view about what change means moving forward, and how we prepare ourselves for when the attacks start happening on the poor. So we are all need to be prepared for the attack of austerity that will definitely come from a bunch of budget crunchers who want to basically attack the poor. So I'm talking about working class communities, people with disabilities, people who are on workfare, people who are precarious workers. All of them are going to get blamed for the pandemic spending, while we seem how to erase and forget the profits that the banks are making, or the $100 billion that was given to corporations and companies across the country in wage subsidies by the federal government. At the end of the day, it's how do we withstand the attacks that are coming forward, hold people accountable, and start thinking about how do we transform the society that we currently have. And I always like to close off. I close off with my students to ask them, is this what democracy means to you? Where every 4 years that you vote. What does democracy mean? Where all peoples are included, not just simply in electoral process, in their workplaces and their communities.
Absolutely. I love that. I think, like you said, like we're fortunate to live in a place like Canada where it's supposed to be democracy, and those our government should be representing all of us, not just a certain subset of people who are maybe well off. Kate had one more in the chat, had one more point to add, is for something that viewers can do is supporting decent work organizing. So working with your union to make sure that workers' rights are respected. We have one question from the live chat, and that's so, and I'll open this up to the floor, is what role do farmers and employers in the agricultural sector have in advocating for improved migrant worker rights, and what are good first steps?
Is that for everybody, or?
Yeah, just for everyone, whoever wants to jump in.
Yeah, so I just want to encourage for all farmers out there to ask if your organizations that you belong to, if they're actually advocating and lobbying in your best interests. Because consistently, the organizations that do lobby at the provincial and the federal levels, they take an adversarial approach. They're against minimum wage increases. They're against the ability to collectively bargain. The more insidious, bloody things would piss me off is that in many parts of the agriculture industry, if you were doing non-agricultural work a couple of years ago, you'd be able to get overtime pay. The employers didn't like it. They took it to courts, and they've been able to once again further shift the power imbalance against workers. So I think right now the position is extremely adversarial because the employer organizations continue to advocate for the expansion of the temporary foreign worker program at the federal level without at the status quo, without any changes that we're calling for, whether it's to social safety net or to immigration changes. And in the provincial, no changes to occupational health and safety, employment standards. And the last point I want to raise is look at this conversation, something that's basic, okay? This is not the Marxist utopian calling for bloody paid sick days. We did not get a sick day program in Ontario because of the pressure of not just simply the agriculture industry, but all employers. And that's not the direction we should be going in.
Absolutely agreed. Thank you for that. Does anyone else want to add on what can employers and farmers be doing to support migrant farm workers? Okay, I'll want to get in one last question, and I'll open up to the floor as well. Going back to food insecurity, we have, this is a question gathered during registration. Is there hope for an income-based solution to address food insecurity? Or is there any movement on it? Do we have any inside information? And do you think that'll happen in our lifetime?
Well, I would say you probably have a bit longer lifetime than I do, but I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime. I do hope it happens in yours. But I mean, we've seen a lot of talk about basic income, right, over these last few years, more than we've ever had before. And we've got a lot of organizing around it. It's made its way onto the agendas, at least of some political parties, caucuses or planning discussions. I don't think we're anywhere near seeing anybody table that as an idea to actually implement. But I hope that even if that doesn't happen, the fact that there's a conversation about income and income adequacy that's in that way, and that's talking about it as a basic right, I hope that is helping to at least a bit transform people's thinking around the idea of delivering income supports. But I mean, I think we are, when you look at the most recent federal budget, we're a very, very long way from seeing federally, at least, progressive policies related to income supports. That's what I would say. I mean, the big ticket item in that budget being an addition of money for people 75 and older, the people with the very lowest risk of poverty and food insecurity in the entire country, with income, the population group who has a guaranteed annual income now, as well as full farmer care and all kinds of other things. I mean, it's just, we're miles from where we need to go if you look at that budget. But symbolically, at least, I think there's some gain with the way in which basic income has become more of a better understood and more talked about in general. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. There's a little bit of hope in there. Maybe in my lifetime. Thank you everyone for joining us today, both panelists and the viewers. Like I think we've come away with some takeaway points is to get involved with those organizations that were mentioned today, to educate yourself, to be more aware, to advocate, to get political, to get involved in your community organizing. In the last year, we've seen big movements, and I can hope that we continue to do so. I think Marissa will be joining us now.
Just gonna put up the slides and say a couple of words. Just bear with me here. So I just wanted to say thank you to everybody. And just before you sign off, if you enjoyed today's event, we do have 2 more upcoming events. So check out our website, nutritionconnections.ca, and they're under the events tab. And before we go, so this is going to be the end, unfortunately, 3 o'clock as we all sign off and get back to our busy work days. Just wanted to say thank you everyone on the line for your attention, and also express our sincere gratitude on behalf of Nutrition Connections and the Ontario Public Health Association, to Avita, our moderator, as well as all of our panelists for sharing their time, perspectives, and insights with the group. Everyone's going to be receiving an email in the next little while with an attached evaluation survey, and just to confirm, all responses will be anonymous. And if you improve this, we really appreciate it because it helps improve our webinar programming moving forward. So with that, I wanted to say good afternoon and hope you all enjoy the rest of your day and have a restful weekend.